I was approached by a Kodansha published author who wanted his next novel, in fact his first novel, to be self-published but to be edited by me. So that's what I'm doing. I'm editing a traditionally published author's book for self-publishing. And I thought I'd take this opportunity to talk about the three main ways of editing fiction: developmental editing, line editing, and copy editing. At least that seems to be the standard, what I've learnt going along. Not that I'm any great expert on these things, but I have written 2 novels and of course had them edited. And for 13 years I was a copy editor for local newspapers. But non-fiction and fiction are 2 very different kettles of fish, I'm sure you can understand, especially when it comes to editing. So there are these 3 broad types of editing, and that's all I'm going to talk about now. Developmental editing, line editing, copy editing. So let's start with the biggest and the weirdest one, is developmental editing. Weird in that there isn't really an equivalent in non-fiction, or at least not in newspapers. Developmental editing is where you take a look at the manuscript that's been written and work out, does the story work? Is the narrative working? Is there a hero? Is there passion? Do things work out the way that they're supposed to? It's not really on the level of the words, in fact. I guess that's the difference. It's about the story. So, for example, the novel I'm working on has a working title of Kamikaze to London. I can tell you more about that, but let's just leave that one there. It's a novel about flying and pioneering flight, and the drama and the interest is in the actual flight and in how the flight goes, and for a certain type of reader that's really interesting. However, it wasn't, when I first got it, it wasn't so much of a story. Well, it is a story there, but in any novel there needs to be conflict, and it's how the characters negotiate conflict or obstacles that makes it interesting, and that makes you want to read on. What will happen next? How will they overcome this, that, and the other? And when I first got the manuscript, it was a little bit lacking in conflict. So my suggestion was to put in a few characters who could personify the conflict. So well, it's not much of a spoiler to announce that it's set before the war in Japan, and the heroes are civilians who want to fly, and they get worried about the rising militarism of Japan. All very good and true, but maybe not so interesting as a novel if you just talk about it in vague terms. So my suggestion was to put a new character in there who's very militaristic, who could be a foil and a rival and a love rival to the hero. The author agreed and wrote a few more scenes and sharpened the conflicts, and it made it a much more readable book. That's developmental editing. So you're not, as I say, you're not really looking at the words, you're looking at the story. And I think it's hard to understand that kind of editing, and it's perhaps the kind of editing that is often skipped by self-publishers who say, well, I just don't want to have any typos. Well, no, this is more about getting the story right, which is perhaps the most important thing. Okay, so that's developmental editing. So that involved going through, reading through, getting what the story was and pulling the story apart, and does it fit the 3-act structure, if we want to do that? Are the characters right? Is it believable? Is it a story worth telling? Once you can satisfy all of those answers, then you can move on to the next stage, which is line editing, which is the next, if you think about the macro down to the micro, the macro bit is the developmental, then the next stage is line editing. That's where you're looking at the structures of the paragraphs, if you like, the lines, line by line, not even word by word, not yet, though there are some. You are looking at the words, you're reading through. Well, at least this is the way I approached it, was I was reading through everything. This is where I'm halfway through, and I'm doing things like making sure that within each scene there's enough conflict, that there isn't too much foreshadowing, like, and this was the moment that I knew everything would be okay, and then he explains how everything was okay. That's boring. What potentially. Making sure there are surprises within the scenes, and it makes the reader want to go read on. And practical advice is to make sure there are enough hooks, like open questions, especially towards the ends of the chapter, and even in the last line of each chapter or scene, that make the reader want to find out what's going to happen next. You know, will the love rival get the girl? Dun dun dun. You've got to keep turning the pages to find out. You know, that's a narrative pull. That there are natural questions that are posed that the reader wants answering, and therefore keeps reading. If all the answers are there for you and laid out for you, and there's no drama of whether it will come true or not, you don't want to keep reading. That's another big difference with non-fiction. So I'm halfway through that, so I can't say that I've got all great knowledge about that. But it's shaping up. The novel's really shaping up, and there are still lots of typos and errors, minor errors on the word level. That will be caught in the final round of editing, which is the copy editing, which is reading through it very carefully, looking for typos, and making sure everything's consistent. Like if you call somebody Koike in one paragraph, and the next scene they're called by their first name, Satoshi or whatever. That doesn't work. It confuses the reader. Making sure all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed, and what you would normally think of as editing, which much the same as for non-fiction. So that's the state of play as it is now. 3 forms of editing. Copy editing is the smallest at the smallest level. Next is line editing, and the broadest level is developmental editing. I can't pretend to be an expert on any of those things, but I'm learning as I go. And anyway, I hope after I've passed through the manuscript, 3, 4, 5 times, it'll be in a much better shape than it first came to me on my desk. And of course, you could keep editing forever, and then there's another topic perhaps for another day, is when to stop editing. But fortunately, we have a tight deadline, and deadlines have a way of focusing the mind. Okay, onward and upward.